Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, these five, the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, the Torah, cover from the creation of the cosmos to the death of Moses. Moses being the principal actor from Exodus 2 on. But besides being the principal actor in the unfolding drama, Moses is also the purported author, at least according to tradition. But this view is hardly supported by the texts themselves. Many tradition-resisting texts present evidence of other hands writing in other times and places, rarely credited for filling in the blanks of our mosaic. Perhaps it's time to recognize and appreciate the ancient authors and editors of the Life and Laws of Moses, members of an oft-forgotten group, the Ghostwriters Guild. We use the term ghostwriter when referring to someone who writes but isn't credited. And such is the case when it comes to the Pentateuch. Now, I know the traditional view. The traditional view, both in synagogue and church, is that Moses is the one who authored the 5 books. In fact, if you open an English Bible, for the most part, you'll see Genesis, the first book of Moses, Exodus, the second book of Moses, and so forth, through the 5, Moses being credited as the author of all 5. But where do we get this idea? I know what we're supposed to believe. I know what tradition says we should believe. But if you were to take these 5 books and read them without having been instructed as to who the author was, would it be natural for you to take away from that reading that Moses is in fact the author of the 5 books? I would propose to you that that is not what you would come away with, but that the reason that most people believe that Moses wrote the 5 books is because tradition, because we've been told, because notes in our various Bibles tell us that these books were authored by Moses. Now, there are 7 references in the Bible, in the Pentateuch, in the 5 books, which tell us that Moses did write something. We need to go through these to figure out exactly what the Bible says Moses wrote, not what tradition says. We know what tradition says, but I want to read what the text of the Pentateuch say. What does the Pentateuch say that Moses wrote? And if it's that he wrote the Pentateuch, then so be it. But if not, let's start with the biblical text. So the first of the 7 references in the Pentateuch which tell us something that Moses wrote. The first one is in Exodus chapter 17, verse 14. Then Jehovah said to Moses, "Write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly wipe out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." So Moses is told by God, by Jehovah, to write this in the Sefer, in a Sefer. Sefer is typically translated in English translations as book, but it's more likely to be a scroll, and very literally it means an account. So Moses is told by God to write the story about Amalek's defeat in a scroll or in an account, and he's then to recite that to Joshua. Now, the next occurrence in the Pentateuch to Moses writing something comes to us in Exodus chapter 24. So go to Exodus 24. This is the second of 7 references to Moses writing. Vayiktov Moshe, and Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord, or of Jehovah. And Moses wrote down all the words. So you have to understand in context what's going on to determine what precisely Moses wrote down in regards to all the words of the Lord. Now, the third reference to Moses writing something comes to us again in the book of Exodus, this time in Exodus chapter 34. Now, Exodus chapter 34 is the narrative concerning the second set of 10 commandments, as we refer to it in English in 3 passages. But the first set of 10 words, the first set of 2 stone tablets, Moses had cast down and shattered when he came down from the mountain and found the children of Israel and the mixed multitude dancing around the golden calf. So he shatters the first set. Exodus 34 is one version in the Pentateuch where God tells Moses, we're going to do this again. Make a second set, bring them up. Now I want to go in Exodus 34 to verse 27, now that you have the background. And it says in chapter 34, verse 27, then the Lord said to Moses, write down these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. So he was there with the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights. He did not eat bread or drink water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments. Now, this is quite a problem whenever we compare Exodus 34 and Deuteronomy 10. These come from different sources. They present the same story, but they do it quite differently. A couple of things stand out in Exodus 34, and it's not the subject of this class, but in Exodus chapter 34, in verse 1, the stage is set. Now, Exodus 34:1, now the Lord said to Moses, cut out for yourself 2 stone tablets like the former ones, and I will write on the tablets the words that were on the former tablets which you smashed. And then the story, the narrative goes on. Moses does as he's told. Verse 4, he cuts the 2 stone tablets. The Lord comes down and meets with him there. If you recall, in chapter 34, verses 5 through 7, reveals his character to Moses. And then, shortly thereafter, beginning in verse 10, God begins to talk about the covenant that he is restoring, that he's going to make, and it goes through 10 words, if you will, but they are not the 10 words that were conveyed earlier in Exodus chapter 20. But be that as it may, when you get to verse 27 and 28, Moses is told to write these words down. Moses is told to write them down, meaning that the covenant is made between God and Israel according to these words, which in Hebrew is hadevarim ha'ele. And then in verse 28, it says that he wrote the tablets, he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant. Now, we already know that it can't be referring to Moses, so there's some questions with Exodus chapter 34, particularly when we look at Exodus 34 side by side with Deuteronomy chapter 10. By the way, the phrase 10 commandments in Hebrew is literally the 10 words, and we only have this phrase appear in the biblical text 3 times. Exodus 34:28, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 13, and Deuteronomy chapter 10 and verse 4. All 3 occurrences in the Hebrew are aseret hadevarim. So the point I want to make about Exodus 34, even though it says that Moses wrote something, it can't be that he wrote down the words on the tablets, because that is described elsewhere as the work of God. But it must mean that he wrote down the covenant in a scroll. Now look with me, our next occurrence. Our next occurrence of Moses writing something is in the book of Numbers, Numbers chapter 33. and verse 2. This is the next in our list of 7 references. Numbers 33:2, it says, Moses recorded their starting places according to their journeys by the command of the Lord, and these are their journeys according to their starting places. In Hebrew, Vayiktov Moshe, and Moses wrote. So here we have an account in Numbers chapter 33 that one of the things that Moses is credited with writing is a series of stops and pullings of stakes, is the way the Hebrew puts it, as they move from location to location, the wilderness journeys. So that is Numbers 33. It's a travel itinerary, according to the writer of Numbers 33, that Moses wrote. Now go with me to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 31, and we're going to begin in verse 9. Vayiktov Moshe, and Moses wrote, this Torah, or this law, as many translations have it, Moses wrote this law, and he gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to the elders of Israel. So here, for the first time in the references within the Pentateuch of Moses writing something, we get a narrative that says, a passage that says that Moses wrote HaTorah Hazot, this Torah, this instruction. It says that he gave this particular Torah to the priests, the sons of Levi, and it's not just any priest, not any sons of Levi, not any of the Levites, but to a very specific group, and this is outside the scope of the class, but it's the group of Levites whose responsibility it was to carry the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, now look down at verse 22 of chapter 31, Deuteronomy 31, verse 22. This is our next reference of Moses writing something, and it says, so Moses, by the way, this is in reference to an instruction given to Moses by God in verse 19 to write the words of a song. Some translations say poem, but it says in verse 22, so Moses wrote down this song on the same day and taught it to the sons of Israel. So here we have Moses writing the words of his song. Now, look at verse 24, Deuteronomy 31, verse 24. And it came about when Moses finished writing the words of this Torah in a scroll until they were completed, that Moses commanded the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, saying, take this scroll of the law, of the Torah, and place it mitzad Aaron, beside the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, so that it may be and remain there a witness against you. So here we have a very clear reference in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 24 through 26, of Moses writing, not only writing the Torah, this Torah, a very specific book, a very specific scroll. Not only does he write it, he writes it to the very end. He takes the completed Torah, this Torah, HaTorah Hazot, he gives it to the Levites who carry the ark, and he tells them to put it mitzad Aaron, and he does. Now the question becomes, what is this sefer? What is this scroll? Is it, as many people would put forward, is it the 5 books? Does it suggest, by reading of this text, that Moses in Deuteronomy 31, verse 9, and verse 24 through 26, do we believe that this is saying that what Moses completed and gave to the Levites is Genesis 1:1 through Deuteronomy 34:12? Well, it can't be, because we still have 3 chapters left in Deuteronomy, let alone the whole Torah being implied. So this presents an interesting question. What was it that Moses completed in Deuteronomy 31 and gave to the Levites? I believe that this is, in fact, the Torah that Moses wrote. But I do believe that that should be distinguished from the Pentateuch. Now, only in Deuteronomy do we read that Moses wrote a Torah. We look at these texts and we have to determine what was the nature of that scroll, and then elsewhere we have to ask the question, if Moses wrote the Torah, who wrote the Pentateuch? All of the references that we went through, all 7 references referring to Moses writing something, all of those are presented in the third person. None of those, even the reference to the writing of this Torah, none of those are presented in the first person as a first-person report from Moses himself. In fact, if we are to look from Exodus chapter 2, when we first meet Moses, if we read from Exodus chapter 2 all the way through the end of the Pentateuch, we will encounter the name Moses 592 times. Now, why is that an interesting point or a point of note? Well, the first thing is it tells me that these references are communicated in the third person, as if, and the most logical way to read these is that someone is telling me the story of Moses, another writer, and not Moses himself. If we look at the book of Exodus, where we first meet Moses, we'll find 261 references to the name Moses. If we move into Leviticus, we'll find 80 references to Moses. All of this third-person narration. If we move into the book of Numbers, it's 216 times Moses is referred to by the hand of a writer other than Moses. If we get to Deuteronomy, we see something different begin to emerge. Just like Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, we do meet with the name Moses. We find Moses in the book of Deuteronomy some 35 times, but we also encounter some first-person narration. So let me make this really plain. Look with me just for a couple of examples to the book of Exodus, and I'll just scroll to look at Exodus chapter 24 and verse 1. Then he said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron." So the writer of Exodus 24 is referring to a story about Moses and Aaron. Now, if you look down at chapter 25 and verse 1, these are just a couple of examples. Remember, Exodus has 261 verses which mention the name Moses. So chapter 25 of Exodus, verse 1, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying." Now, if Moses were writing this, the most natural way to communicate that would be to say, "The Lord spoke unto me." But it doesn't. It says, "The Lord spoke unto Moses." The writer is writing outside of this event. Now look with me, a couple from Leviticus. Look at Leviticus chapter 1, verse 1. In Leviticus 1:1, it says, "Now the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting." Again, third-person narration. And this goes on in chapter 4 and chapter 6 and all the way through. There's not a single first-person reference in Leviticus, in the book of Numbers, or in the book of Exodus. All of the narration is third person. Now, look with me, though, at the book of Deuteronomy, at Deuteronomy chapter 2 and verse 2. This is where we enter something quite interesting. It says in Deuteronomy 2:2, "And the Lord spoke to me, saying," you've circled this mountain long enough. Notice this particular text is presented as coming directly from Moses. The Lord spoke to me. Now, you're not going to see this in Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers. Only in Deuteronomy, and not always in Deuteronomy. Remember, there are 35 references to Moses in Deuteronomy, so it's not all first-person narration, but where it is, it's quite interesting. So look down at verse 9, chapter 2, verse 9. The Lord said to me, do not attack Moab, nor provoke them to war, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession. Look down at verse 17, chapter 2. That the Lord spoke to me. So again, we see this as we work our way through the book of Deuteronomy. We see first-person narration. We also see some third-person narration. But when we see third-person narration, one most likely solution to that is that this is non-Mosaic material. This is material produced by someone other than Moses. And we see other things aside from third-person narration that makes us think that there is an author or a guild of authors responsible for some of this material. One example is the use of anachronism. Anachronism is when you find in a written document, for instance, material that is not contemporary with the surrounding material. So it's an intrusion from another time. And we see this in several examples. I'll go through a couple of these. One is in Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis chapter 12 and verse 6, it says, and Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanites were in the land at that time. This particular phrase, now the Canaanites, this announcement, this comment that the Canaanites were in the land at that time is a giveaway, but a lot of people miss it. It's suggesting that this was written in a time when the Canaanites are no longer in the land. So the writer is telling us, well, at that time, the Canaanites were still in the land. But we know from the biblical narratives that the whole purpose of the conquest, which took place after the death of Moses, was meant, although it didn't succeed, to eradicate the Canaanites from the land. So this is written at another time. Look down at chapter 13, Genesis chapter 13 and verse 7. Genesis chapter 13 and verse 7 says, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living in the land at that time. You see, so what this is suggesting is that at the least, some of these passages are written in a time when this is the case, clearly a time other than the time of Moses. Now, one passage that is a giveaway is in the book of Genesis chapter 36. In the book of Genesis chapter 36 and verse 31, there's mention of a king's list, the kings of Edom, and it says that these are the kings that reigned in Edom before Israel had a king. This seems to be suggesting that this text was written at a time when Israel did have a king, but it's referring back to a time when Israel didn't have a king. Now, here are a couple of others. I want you to look with me at the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 16 and verse 35. And by the way, Exodus 16 is telling us the story about the manna, the bread that sustained the children of Israel during the wilderness wanderings. But look at verse 35 of Exodus 16. And the sons of Israel ate the manna for 40 years until they came to an inhabited land. They ate the manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. Now, I'm not suggesting that this isn't true. Understand, I'm trying to determine who wrote this. Now, the reason that I'm saying it's anachronistic, that it's out of time, is because Exodus 16 is before the children of Israel have even gotten to Sinai, to Horeb. They're still in the first year, and Exodus 16:35 tells us that Israel ate the manna for 40 years. Clearly, this has to be written after the 40 years have expired, meaning this was not written even by Moses, because the manna continued until after Moses died and they had crossed into the land. Now, there are a couple of other passages that we find. In fact, we see quite a few of these throughout the Hebrew Bible, aside from the fact that most of the Pentateuch is written in third-person narration. Here's another text which it seems unlikely, not let alone the fact that it's in the third person, but it seems unlikely to be at the hand of Moses, because it says, Numbers 12:3, "Now the man Moses was very humble, more than any person who was on the face of the earth." It's unlikely that the most humble man on all the earth would write that he was, in fact, the most humble man on all the earth. But we have other evidence of another group of writers. And I realize that this is challenging to those who have been taught to believe that Moses wrote the entire 5 books. But that's not biblical. It's a traditional idea that's disproved by a simple reading of the text themselves. Look with me at Deuteronomy chapter 1. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 1 says the following: "These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan, in the wilderness, in the Arava, opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Lavan, Hatzerot, and Dizahav. It's 11 days' journey from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. In the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the sons of Israel in accordance with everything that the Lord had commanded him to declare to him, after he had defeated Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth and in Edrei. Across the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses began to explain this Torah, saying," all of this, Deuteronomy 1, chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, telling us that these are the words of Moses, where they were communicated, and so forth, happen to be not the words of Moses. These passages are a lead-in by a narrator, by a voice outside who is not even claiming to be Moses. This is the point. If this person were trying to be Moses, they would communicate in the first person. They would put themselves with Moses in the narration. But this writer has no idea that we would later develop traditions to say that Moses wrote this, when it clearly is not saying that this is Moses. Now, how do we know this is not Moses? First of all, it's in the third person. It's communicated in such a way that it's telling us that these are the words that Moses spoke. The second reason we know beyond any doubt that it's not Moses is that it says very clearly that the person is located in the land of Canaan. They are west of the Jordan. How do we know that? Because we read the writer here, this ghostwriter, if you would like to prefer to call this person a ghostwriter, this person who is Moses is credited with this, but Moses didn't write it. This person says very clearly that these are the words that Moses spoke on the other side of the Jordan, meaning the side that I, the writer, am not on. So the bottom line is the writer is writing in another place, clearly not Moses. And it's very easy to deduce that this is written at a time later than when Moses actually did say these words on the other side. Now, by the time you get to verse 6, though, verse 6, something happens. You get a switch. The narrator tells us that these are the words, and then ultimately the words of Moses come through. The Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, "You've stayed long enough at this mountain, turn and set out," and so forth. In this chapter, chapter 1 of Deuteronomy, we get both. We get some of what is presented as the words of Moses, first-person narration. We also get the intrusion of other writers or another writer. We get a writer other than Moses, one who is speaking in the third person, who is using anachronism, who is bringing in elements that give it away that it's not Moses. We have to be careful. We have to read carefully in order to discern one from the other. By the way, if you were to take the narration in Deuteronomy and compare it, list it side by side with similar stories communicated in Exodus and Numbers in particular, you would see that the narration, the sources are different. For instance, if you read the story of the spies in the book of Numbers, chapter 13 and 14, and you compare that with the narrative of the spies from Deuteronomy 1, you'll see different details, conflicting details. The question becomes, which one reflects the actual history? Is it the first-person account in Deuteronomy or the third-person narration in the book of Numbers? That I leave to the viewer, but they are different. It's the same with the setting up of a judicial system as it's conveyed in Deuteronomy chapter 1. Elsewhere, in the book of Exodus, we have that Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, is responsible for this idea. Deuteronomy doesn't mention that. Doesn't mean that it doesn't know it. I'm just saying that it does not mention. In fact, Jethro is not mentioned at all in the book of Deuteronomy. If we look at the story in the book of Numbers chapter 27, we read that Moses finds out that he can't cross into the land because of his own sins. But if we read in the book of Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 37, and Deuteronomy chapter 3 and verse 24 through 28, we read that Moses' story in the first person is different. He doesn't say that it's because of his own sin. He says that it's on their account, the people account. So who wrote the third person account? Who wrote the third person material? If you're not convinced yet, let's continue. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 2. Deuteronomy chapter 2, and we'll begin in verse 8. So we passed beyond our brothers, the sons of Esau, who live in Seir, away from the Arava road, away from Elat and Ezion Geber, and we turned and passed through by the way of the wilderness of Moab. Then the Lord said to me, "Do not attack Moab, nor provoke them to war, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession, because I've given Ar to the sons of Lot as a possession. The Emim lived there previously, a people great, numerous, and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they too are regarded as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. The Horites previously lived in Seir, but the sons of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them and settled there in their place, just as Israel did to the land of their possession, which the Lord gave them. Now rise and cross over the Wadi Zered yourself." So we crossed over the Wadi Zered. Now, did you notice anything about what I just read? Because we often read over things that are quite telling. In this passage, we get evidence beyond any doubt of a later writer, of someone other than Moses who's telling us something, you might say it's helpful, but it's nonetheless not Moses. Now, if you look closely, if I look at verse 8, everything is fine. It's describing the journey. We passed our brothers, the sons of Esau, who live in Seir, away from the Arava road. We turned and passed through by the way of the wilderness of Moab. Verse 9, the Lord said to me, don't attack Moab. All right, all of that's fine. Now, if I skip down to verse 13, now arise, cross over the Wadi Zered yourself. So we crossed over the Wadi Zered. All of that's fine. But I want you to listen closely this time in verse 10. The Emim lived there previously, a people as great, numerous, and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they too are regarded as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. Now, some Bibles even put all of this in parentheses, but many, because of tradition, would claim that Moses wrote this. But listen to this, verse 12. The Horites previously lived in Seir, but the sons of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them and settled in their place, just as Israel did to the land of their possession, which the Lord gave them. This is written after the time of Moses, because it clearly is written describing how Israel dispossessed those in their land to make the point about the Emim. So this is an intrusion from another time. And we have many examples just like that. Now, it's only a problem for people who clinch tightly to a tradition that is not biblical. When we say that the Pentateuch from Genesis 1:1 to Deuteronomy 34:12 is written by Moses, which it never claims, it sets us up for problems. These examples were not written by Moses nor in his time. And again, if you're hearing that as being a problem, it's because you're holding a tradition that isn't biblical. So let it go. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 34. Let's look at Deuteronomy 34. The end of the book of the Pentateuch. Now, verse 1. Now Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, and all Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah as far as the western sea and the Negev and the territory in the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to him, this is the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not go over there. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, in accord with the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley, in the land of Moab, opposite Beit Peor. But no one knows his burial place to this day. Although Moses was 120 years old when he died, his eyesight was not dim, nor had his vigor left him. So the sons of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses came to an end. Now there are two views on who wrote this. It's in the third person, so I would propose it wasn't Moses. But there are some who say, no, Moses as a prophet wrote these words through his tears. That's one of the views in rabbinic literature. Another view communicated to us, recorded in Baba Batra 15, which records this is who wrote this particular book in this section of the book. in Baba Batra 15, there is a more sensible solution. It says that Joshua wrote these 8 verses. And I would tell you that neither of those is supported by the text. Remember, I want to look at the text. I know the traditional arguments. I know the views that people hold, but I'm not interested in that. What does the text say? Could Joshua have written this? The answer to that, at this point, many people would say yes. But let's keep reading it. Look at verse 9. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. It's most natural to think that Joshua didn't write this either, because Joshua is mentioned in the same context. So Joshua would have to be saying, if Joshua wrote the verses above, now Joshua the son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him, etc. And the sons of Israel, let's keep reading, verse 9, listened to him, meaning Joshua, and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. Since that time, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. For all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all his servants and all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. And I could shout amen. I agree with this. I believe this. I believe that never has arisen a greater prophet than Moses. What I don't believe is that Moses wrote this. What I don't believe is that Joshua wrote this. I believe that this is written at a much later period. I agree with it. It could be inspired. Whoever wrote this did a wonderful job, but it wasn't Moses. Here's the point. This is what I'm saying. It is time that we give credit to those who actually wrote it, or at least stop giving credit for something beautifully written and well written to someone who did not write it. That's the main point. If we think about these texts as being written over a period of time, and the evidence suggesting that is all over the place, we've not committed anything wrong. So, for instance, where it says, never has arisen a prophet greater than Moses, if that statement is spoken within days after Moses died, I'm not being funny, but imagine yourself standing around the grave and the people of Israel are mourning, and somebody says, never has been a man like Moses, never has arisen one since Moses. People would look at you and say, he just died. I mean, give it some time. But if that same statement is made 100, 200, 500 years, I don't know, if it's written over a longer period of time, then it has even more meaning that there has never been a prophet like Moses. Now, it's interesting when we consider Deuteronomy, because in Deuteronomy chapter 18, it talks about a prophet like Moses who would rise, who is like Moses. But that's another class. Within the books of the Pentateuch, within these 5 books, we meet with traces of Mosaic teaching. But it's against the backdrop, if you will, of other writers, each presenting the life and laws of Moses from their unique perspective. We also encounter some first-person narration, which seems to say it's most logical that this first-person narration matches what we would expect to come from Moses. Now, when we compare the first-person narration against the third-person narration, when they both describe the same events, we have decisions to make. But it's within these texts these 5 books, particularly dealing with the life and laws of Moses, from Exodus chapter 2 all the way through Deuteronomy chapter 34:12, that we have to find, we have to search and begin to find the message of Moses. But as we read, we have to be honest to Moses. We have to be honest in our approach. We have to distinguish between the words of Moses as presented in another mouth, in another hand, from the words of Moses presented from his own mouth, from his own hand. This distinction has far-reaching implications.